Good evening. Thank you for being here. If you're a guest here, you're our honored guest tonight. I'm going to talk about the topic of contentment in a world of consumerism. Many people who leave the United States and go off to other countries where people might not have as many things in general often describe noticing a distinct difference in the mindsets of the people that they're around. They say that these people that they've been around seem to be in more interconnected communities in which times people spend less time working and more time being together. They talk about people who seem to live simple lives of contentment, even though they don't have many of the luxuries that we might often take for granted. I believe that many of us may have a problem with contentment, and I'd like to start by describing the problem before we move on to talking about a solution. Paul said in 1 Timothy 6, 7 through 10, "We have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs." So he's encouraging Timothy to live a life of contentment and describing the dangers that could happen if he fails to do so. And this one phrase he says is, "If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content." That's difficult for a lot of us. I believe one of the reasons it might be difficult for us is because our society really doesn't want us to take this verse to heart, at least not the people who stand to profit from our failing to take this verse to heart. I'm convinced that our society, if we took these verses to heart, might very well be the doom of shopping malls and Walmarts everywhere. And as much as I like Amazon.com, I'm afraid that would be the doom of Amazon as well. If we really took this to heart and said, with food and covering, we'll be content. Well, we have what we need. Any marketing major will tell you that there are rooms full of people who are paid to get together and figure out how you can convince people to buy things that they don't even want, how you can invent new needs for people. And, if you think about it, it makes sense that this aspect of our society may be working against our contentment, because if we're content with the way we look, why would we spend a lot on beauty products? Or if we're content with our wardrobe, why would we go out and buy a bunch of expensive clothes? If we're content with the car that we drive now, why would we go out and buy a nice new one? So there are a lot of people who stand to profit from our lack of contentment. That may be one reason why it's so difficult. Another reason it might be difficult is because we already have so much and we have such a prospect of gaining more. This verse in Proverbs chapter 30, it says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I may not be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or that I may not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God." So many people in many different circumstances may find themselves with so little that it becomes a challenge to their faith, but many of us might find ourselves with such riches by the standards of most in the world that becomes challenging for us, because there's sort of this ironic way in which having more actually makes us less happy, because we have this constant prospect of getting more, and we can always sort of convince ourselves that, well, this time if I get the newest gadget, if I get the best new thing, then it really will fill the hole that I have inside of me. I think a longer passage that would describe this is in Luke 12, in the words of Jesus. "So someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me.' But he, Jesus, said, 'Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?' Then he said to him, or to them, 'Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying, 'The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.' You think about Paul's advice to Timothy: if we have food and covering, we have what we need, then we can be content. But this man, even though he had much more than what he needed, instead of then choosing to do something productive to help others, he just decided to find a way to keep it all for himself. And maybe that's what we're tempted to do when we already have so much, and we think that if I can just get a little bit more, then I'll finally be at peace, I'll finally be at ease. Finally he had so much in his barns that there was no way he would ever have to worry about being in need again. There's a poet that I sometimes like to read named Khalil Gibran. He said, "Is not dread of thirst when your well is full, the thirst that is unquenchable." Here's this rich man. He's got all of this stuff stored up, and yet he still doesn't feel comfortable. He still needs to build a bigger barn and get more things. But I think that's often what we do in America. We put away more and more money for retirement, but we're still worried that we're not going to have enough to do everything that we want to do, when maybe we could be helping others with some of our extra. But the discontentment is not just physical. It's not just gadgets or money in the bank or what kind of car that we have that might cause us to feel discontent. There's also a spiritual side to it. You see in James 1:13 through 15, he says, "Let no one say when he's tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust." And that word lust really it means like an excessive desire for something, as if you're not going to feel satisfied until you can get it. He says, "Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." So that idea of lust, it's talking about this lack of contentment, that I need something extra in order to feel okay. I think there's a pervading sense to a lot of people that the modern man just feels disconnected and he feels empty and he needs something, and he's always reaching out for something to help make him feel better. And in that emptiness, we can often reach out towards all kinds of trouble. So here's one possible solution: stop desiring. After all, James kind of makes it sound like the answer is stop wanting anything. Especially if you read the first part of James chapter 4, 1 through 3. He says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You're envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel." I imagine that practitioners of Buddhism, for instance, might really appreciate the first part of this passage, because the idea is that you want to eliminate desire because your desires are what cause all the problems in life. But I think the second part might kind of come as a surprise. In the second part, he says, "You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures." So I would suggest that the problem isn't quite as simple as just not having desires. And that way we eradicate all of our problems. Because the problem is that our desires are misdirected. And we hope in the wrong things to make us whole. And thus the solution is actually learning to have good and pure and healthy desires towards things that are actually meaningful and God-given, and ultimately towards God himself. When you look at it that way, the emptiness that so many feel in the world, the feeling of discontentment, is actually a good thing if it can point us towards God, if it can help us realize that there is actually something that is missing. It's just that the thing that's missing isn't a new car or a new boat or a new house. It's actually God. And God says in Psalm 37:4, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." He doesn't say, delight in the Lord, and then you'll have no desire for anything whatsoever. It sounds like we'll be given new and holy desires, and if our desire is ultimately for God himself, then we have something that we can really find satisfaction and contentment in. So I'd say the solution is to seek God, to direct your desire towards knowing him. I believe all of us have desires. All of us from time to time feel a longing for purpose, for meaning, for experience. And what we're looking for ultimately is God. If we look in other areas, we'll ultimately be disappointed. We could look towards more things. We could look towards sexual promiscuity. We could look towards the praises or approval of men. But if we do that, we'll keep finding ourselves disappointed unless we turn to God. There are many passages that teach this. Matthew 6:31-34 says, "Do not worry then, saying, 'What will we eat? Or what will we drink? Or what will we wear for clothing?' For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." I believe it can be hard for us to be content if we do not live lives of purpose. What he says here is seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and it seems that he's describing a reason to live, a mission to carry out. And when we don't feel that sense of purpose in life, then we feel empty. So he's actually giving us the advice to build our identity on spiritual service as opposed to the acquisition of goods. I think we often do the opposite. Maybe we make sure that we have everything that we need or want and that we have enough time to do all of our hobbies. And then if we have any part left over, maybe we'll use that to meet other people's needs or to spread the gospel. But he says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Have this meaning, this purpose at the center of your life. In John 4:13-14, he said to the woman at the well, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life." And there's an aspect of that concept that's gaining in popularity today, I think. It's become sort of popular to say that happiness comes from within and is not to be found in external things, but it has to be found in a renewable source. But it's important to notice that Jesus doesn't just say we should drink water that we find within ourselves. He says it's water that he can give to us. In the same chapter in John 4, the disciples are urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples were saying to one another, "No one brought him anything to eat, did he?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." So this common desire that we all understand, and this need, really, the need for food, for him almost seems secondary, at least in this case, to being able to fulfill this purpose and this mission and being close to his Father. So I guess to sort of summarize what I've said, being content in any circumstance doesn't necessarily mean that we don't want anything. It means that we want God. We want what is good, and we have a faith and a trust in him. If we do walk daily with God, what could be more satisfying than that? But if we're not walking daily with God, then how can we ever hope to feel satisfied? I guess in that sense, discontentment can be a good thing. If we are not right with God, we shouldn't just feel comfortable about that and just be perfectly content with the situation that we're in. In an interesting way, discontentment is actually pointing us towards God, and in that sense it is a good thing. So hopefully, to the degree that it's appropriate for all of us, we will feel discontent with our lives, to the extent that we haven't been willing to obey God, to the extent that we haven't been willing to follow wherever he leads. But if we will follow him, hopefully we will learn that true contentment that comes not from always buying new things or reaching out in some other way to try and sort of self-medicate the emptiness that we feel, but finding our ultimate satisfaction in him.